All right, hello. So in this video, I'm going to go over how to actually use JavaScript to make web pages interactive. So how we basically be able to actually use the programming language that we talked about in the last video to actually modify web pages so that you actually can use it in the web. So we're going to start with sort of some basic approaches, and then we'll sort of eventually get into the interactive part of the video. So it's a little bit of stuff to go through, so this will probably be another long video, but so it goes. Great, so let's get started. So as I mentioned previously, JavaScript is a sort of a, this general programming language is mostly used to make interactive web pages. The last video really talked about sort of like JavaScript sort of as programming language and sort of what some syntax you need to do that. We're going to take that syntax ideas and then apply it to the second part, right? Actually making web pages interactive, how that works. Okay, so what we're going to do, what JavaScript lets us be able to do, is it lets us be able to do what's called manipulating the DOM. So the DOM is an acronym. It stands for Document Object Model, and it's basically a sort of programmatic model, way of understanding and sort of thinking about the HTML, right? So effectively, the DOM is the sort of the data structure produced by your HTML when it's rendered in the browser. So the structure is this kind of this tree of elements, right? We have elements that are their kids and elements inside of them, and so forth. So if you think about, basically what you see in the Elements tab of your developer tools, right? This thing here is actually the DOM. That's not what's in your HTML source code, right? Which is the source. This is the sort of the actual like rendered output, the sort of the stuff that's actually currently on the screen, and that's the DOM. What JavaScript lets us do is it lets us modify this. So we can basically start changing the content of the stuff that's in the browser, right? Changing that HTML using JavaScript. This won't actually change your .html file. It'll just change the stuff that's sort of as it's running in the browser. All right, so how are we going to do that? So it's possible to use, so there's a bunch of DOM manipulation stuff built into the JavaScript that's sort of just provided by browsers that you can do fairly easily. However, in order to make life a little bit easier for us, and particularly for getting some of the kinds of effects we want to do, particularly for homework and exercise and stuff like that, instead of using the built-in structure, we're going to be using something called jQuery. So jQuery is a library. It's a set of effectively pre-written code. It's a bunch of JavaScript code that somebody else wrote that we're going to be able to just use, and without having to like do a bunch of copying and pasting. We're just going to say like, hey, use this, and then we'll be able to good to go. And it basically gives us a bunch of functions that are going to make life a little bit easier for actually doing this DOM manipulation. It's not a ton easier, right? Because actually the JavaScript stuff that's built in the browser is still pretty good, and it's pretty close, and you'll notice they're very similar if you go look at both pieces. But I think jQuery is going to make life just a little bit easier, so we're going to go ahead and use that as an approach. And hopefully that won't come back and bite me. Okay, so in order to do this, we basically need to start by saying, okay, I want to take this set of other like JavaScript code that's going to make it easier for me to write my own JavaScript code, and I need to make sure that that's available and that's included in my web page. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to include another script tag, where the source for my script tag is not going to be a JS file that's on it's sort of in my repository or in my project, but it's going to be one that exists out on the web. So this is the same way that we included the Bootstrap CSS framework. We're doing the exact same kind of thing here, except instead of including bootstrap.css, we're going to be including a jQuery.js file. Really, jQuery is in many ways like Bootstrap. It's the same kind of concept, where jQuery is basically going to be like it's almost think of it as like the Bootstrap of JavaScript, right? Where it's going to it adds some stuff that makes things a little bit easier and a little bit nicer, a little bit predefined, so you don't have to do the work yourself. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this script tag, and this is copied off of their website, and you can copy it off the side as well. But your source is going to be code.jquery.com/jquery-3.6.0, which is the latest version. .min, because it's a minified file, so this version of the file has no white space, so it's going to be as small as possible. And then it's a .js, it's a JS file. And we're going to go ahead and include that in our HTML file, and we're going to put it after our own script. Wrong way. We're going to put it before our own script. And it's really, really important that you put it before your own script, because that way, when the browser is running through this code, right, it's going through and it's rendering all these pieces, it makes your header, it makes your main, it's going to first go ahead and run this first script, the one at line 31, and get jQuery set up and running and ready to go, and everything will be great, right? Basically, it's going to, you can think of it almost like installing jQuery, but it's not actually installing anything. It's just sort of making it available. Then once jQuery is available, then we're going to work on our script, and because our script comes after jQuery, our script's going to be able to use all the functions and all the code that jQuery had already provided. If we put jQuery after our script, then our script would try to go say, hey, jQuery, do some stuff, but jQuery hasn't been loaded yet, right? Because remember, the browser is going top to bottom. So the first thing, so the top first, stuff at the bottom second. So we're going to make sure we put jQuery at the end of our script in order to be able to make sure this all works. All right, and so then with jQuery installed now and sort of ready to go, we can start using it inside of our script file. So we're going to, again, go into our index.js file. I've got currently a console log here just to sort of show that like my page is running. Here I've got some just sample content so we can manipulate it. That's what's all going on here. Okay, now in order to actually manipulate, in order to modify any of this DOM stuff, right, in order to go start tweaking or manipulating any of this header or this, the paragraph, these sections, in order to start doing any of this stuff, we need to have some way of referring to it. We need to have some way of talking about it in the JavaScript. So in the JavaScript, the way that we're going to refer to these HTML elements is we have to do what's called getting a reference to them. We have to do what's called selecting them, right? We have to basically be able to say, hey, you, and I have to basically put a name tag, put a label on it so that I can then talk about that particular element. The way that we're going to do that, and the way that jQuery lets us do that, is by using this really weird-looking punctuation function. So this is a function, the same way we've used function. We talked about functions in the last video, but this function is just called $. And the reason it's just called $sign is to try to make it quick to type and hard and not likely to mess up any other existing functions. Technically, this is what's called the jQuery function or the jQuery selector function. You can actually even call it, even type out the words jQuery and it works the same way, but the $sign is the way you'll usually see this written. And it's a good practice so that if you look at a lot of existing web pages, if you have to go tweak them or modify them and see what's going on, a lot of them will use jQuery or something like it, so you'll see this $sign showing up all over the place. Okay, so you call this $sign function. So again, the same way we would normally call a function, like if I called my function and I put parentheses after it to call it, to say do that work from that function, in this case we're going to call the jQuery function. Now, inside the parentheses, the argument this is going to take is going to be a string, so it's going to be in quotes, right, because we're going to give it some text. But that text is going to be the text of a CSS selector. So anything that you would normally put in, right, so if you had a CSS file, right, the thing that you would normally put, like if I had a CSS file, I might say, here's something that I want to, right, I want to write some CSS that's going to apply to H1s. I want to write some CSS that's going to apply to my class. I'm going to write some CSS that's going to apply to my element with some ID. I'm going to write some CSS that's going to apply to, I'm going to the example I've got, right? So I'm going to go inside of anchor elements that are inside the nav, right? These things here, these are all selectors. They're a way of referring to specific HTML elements in CSS. Well, in jQuery, we're going to use the exact same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, take what would normally go inside the selector here, like h1.myClass or nav space a, and I'm going to put that content inside the quotes inside of my parentheses here in my function. And what this is going to do is this is going to say that this expression is going to go effectively search for and find the H1 elements, right? Select those elements just like CSS selects them, and get a reference to that, which we can then assign to a variable in order to put a label on it. So for example, I could call this guy the heading element. And so again, what I'm doing is I'm going to say, let's select the H1s, right? Go find that H1 element in my DOM, right? Go find my H1 element right there in my DOM, and let's go ahead and basically put a label, a nickname on that H1. We're going to call that thing heading element. And that way I can refer to this heading element later by writing different code later. So at the moment, it's not doing anything particular. I can't even really log this out because jQuery makes it look all funky, and I don't want to confuse anything. But basically, this is going to get me a reference. This is going to get me a variable, a label that refers to that particular element. So again, I can use any kind of valid CSS selector. So I can use things like ID selectors. You'll see those a lot with JavaScript. The real reason you'd ever want to use an ID selector is almost primarily for JavaScript stuff, because JavaScript wants to be able to refer to very specific elements because they're the ones I want to manipulate, versus CSS that we want to be a little bit more general. Like JavaScript, we want to be pretty specific because I only want to apply to that specific element. And we, of course, then can select lots of different elements as well. So it's worth noting, again, that this, not again, but it's worth noting that this jQuery selector function will select all the elements that match a particular set. So my page only has a single H1, so if I get the heading element, that's just going to be one thing, right? There's only one H1 on my page. But I have multiple paragraphs on this page, which means that if I want to, for example, get a list, get all the paragraphs, I could say select paragraph, and that's going to say select get, and that's going to get basically a name tag, a label for the label, which I'm calling all paragraphs, because I'm coming up with a good variable name, that refers to the whole set of paragraphs, right? So this refers to the whole set. You can think of them almost as like a group, or like a set of all the paragraphs together. The fact that I called this all paragraphs there's nothing magical about these variable names. They're just sort of good descriptive names explaining what's going on, right? I could have just called this paragraphs. I could have called it P's, but PS is like not a good readable name, so paragraphs would be better. I kind of like using the word all just so I sort of know that's referring to all paragraphs. Technically, this is all H1 elements, but there's only one of those things, so I'm going to name it heading element. I'll also see it naming it H1 element. Again, there's nothing special about any of these names. Just ways for, refers to all, but it's just one. Okay, so that's going to let us be able to then refer to, basically put labels, names, name tags onto these different HTML elements, so I can then start referring to those elements when I want to then use my JavaScript to tell my page to do some work, or do some changes to it, to start manipulating them. Okay, so let's start doing that. So there's lots of different methods then that jQuery provides that lets us manipulate and modify HTML elements. And so I'm going to sort of go through a couple of really common ones, the kind of ones you'll likely want to use, sort of the most easiest basic ones you'll want to use, but there are a ton of other ones. If you go to jQuery sort of document here, actually, let me show you these in action so you can see how it works, and then I'll go to documentation stuff. Okay, so real basic example, if I want to change the text of an element, I want to change like what text is inside of an element, I can call a function, I can go to that paragraph I've selected, right, that thing, that label refer to that particular element, and I can call the .text method on it, putting inside the parentheses then what I want that new text to be. So let's go run that as an example. So in my example, you'll notice that I've got my H1 is listed as interactive JavaScript demo. I can now take that heading element, I can call the text function on it, and jQuery is currently set, VS Code can be set up, and I'll make sure to set up for exercise and stuff so that it will automatically autocomplete these things. And if you have problems with that, it should do it pretty much just automatically, and if you have issues with that, let me know. But I can then go ahead and modify the text and specify what I want the text of this element to be. So I could say I want this thing's text to be maybe I'm different. Oh, hold on. I'm different. There we go. So thing to note with quotes, right? So I'm sort of using single and double quotes kind of interchangeably, except that because I wanted to use a single quote inside of this text, I had to make sure I used double quotes on the outside. If I put single quotes in here, then JavaScript says, "Oh, look, that's start and end of the text," and then it gets really confused about what this M is doing right there. So generally what I do is I'm just using like a single letter or two, like just a tag. I tend to use single quotes, and if I'm using like actual words, I put them in double quotes. Okay, great. So this line of code, line 8, will take this heading's text and modify it, change it so that it now says I'm different. Now, you'll notice that just writing that code didn't do anything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to need to refresh my web page. And when I refresh my web page, you'll notice now that my H1 is different. If you watch it down here, let's see if I can get it to show up. All right, so if you watch it down there, you notice how when I hit refresh, the heading sort of like it flickers a little bit? What's happening here is that the HTML is running. It's originally creating my H1 as saying interactive JavaScript demo, but then when my page gets down here, down to the script then starts to run, right? So it's going through that series of instructions, and it does these 4 things. It gets to line 8, and then it's going to change what used to be there to now be I'm different. Now you notice that what's rendered, what shows up in the web page, has been changed, but what's in my index.html page has not changed. This is still exactly the same. So it's not that we're not changing the source code in my JavaScript. I'm simply changing what shows up at the end. I'm going to acknowledge that these examples, these first examples, are going to feel a little bit silly because it's almost like, why are we using JavaScript to change this? Why don't we just change it inside the HTML to begin with? And that's because we're eventually going to want to be able to do this changing interactively, like when in response to the user doing some, clicking on buttons, for example. But I'm just trying to show you how we can change things before you start going through how to change them interactively. Great, so that'll change the content of that. I can, let's see, what else can we do? Let's do more things. We can change the content to include more HTML. So you'll notice that if I try to use this text function and I'm trying to put in some HTML, like I'm very different because it's going to be different. If I refresh that, then it's going to, the jQuery is going to treat the EM, even though that's written as HTML, it's going to treat it as plain text. Like it's actually going to think, oh, you just wrote a less than symbol, the EM, and then a greater than symbol. If I want to actually say, no, I really did mean HTML when I did that, then instead of using the text function, we would use the HTML function that's going to then make this content, but use that content as HTML content. I'm very different. In practice, the text method function is the right one to use unless you really need HTML inside there. It's generally safer to not use an HTML. It just helps avoid like people doing malicious things with your website. So HTML is the way to go. Cool. All right, we can do that. We can start changing text. We can change attributes of elements. Like, for example, I can change the source attribute, and we're going to do that by calling the .attr, ATTR, which is short for attribute, function on my element. So, for example, I could say, let me get, let's see, I got what do we got? I got an image here, right? You like my image, my little Lego head. So I could say, let's see, this is going to be the Lego head. Image is going to be, I'm going to go select my image by using my jQuery thing. And then I can say, take my Lego head image, and I can set its source to be something new. That's my happy image. I also have a surprised image. So I'm going to set its source to, mix up my languages. I'm going to use the attribute method to set its source property, right? That's the first argument. What attribute do I want to change? Comma, and then I'm going to use as a second argument then, what do I want to change that source to be? So in this case, I want to change it to be image/surprise.png. Now I do that. Now my Lego guy looks surprised, right? Something has happened. So again, the important things to note here, sort of the confusing syntactical piece, is that we're not using an equal symbol or anything in assigning this. We're basically calling this .attr attribute function, specifying first which attribute to change, comma, what to change that attribute to. If we had a hyperlink, right, so if I had a hyperlink of some kind, I might call the attribute function to change its href to be https:// right? We can be able to modify, for example, where a hyperlink went to. We can do all that kind of thing as well. Worth noting also that if you don't put in a second argument, if you just call like image.attr source, that will actually let you then effectively get whatever that attribute value happens to be and save it in a variable. So for example, if I want to know, well, what is the current source of my Lego guy? I could say the current source could be my Lego head image attribute source. And again, I'm going to then take that attribute. I'm not going to change it by giving it a second argument. I'm instead just going to save it, assign it to a variable to save it in some variable, and then I can do something like log it out to know what the current source is, and then come back. There we go. And then when I run my code in my console, it then logs out that the current source is image_surprise.png, right? That's what's getting logged out at line 14. Great, so we can do that as an example. We can change classes, so CSS classes for elements pretty easily. There's an add class function, and there's also a remove class function. I don't have that in the slides because I didn't have room. But so for example, I could go to my, let's select the header. Right, so I'm going to take my header element, and let's set my header element, add its class, and we're going to add the background dark class to it to make my heading dark. Okay, dark. Well, that looked a little odd. So let's go ahead and let's add in the background dark class, and let's also add in the text white class. Right, these are just Bootstrap classes. Oh, that wasn't the right one. Let's see. Wait, let me double check, make sure I'm getting it right. Nope. Okay, never mind. We can't actually we can't actually do 2 arguments. That we would have to go ahead and just do it a second time. Add class text white. Yeah. Ta-da! I'm very different. Look, you can even see the flash now, right? Where it starts out as interactive JavaScript and then it eventually changes to become this other thing. So yeah, we can use this to add classes to our elements. The thing that I did here to note, in this case, I selected that element, right, that header, but rather than selecting it here and assigning it to a value, to a variable, which I then called my .attr function on, or my add class function on, I just went ahead and did the whole thing as one line of code. So I just said, great, go grab the header and add the class directly to that. Go grab the header and then add the class directly to that. You'll see this kind of thing a lot in other programming. Either approach is totally fine to use. I kind of recommend that maybe you lean on doing this kind of thing where you actually select the element, assign it to a variable, and then modify that variable. It tends to make it a little bit easier to follow what's going on, right? There's less like random punctuation here where you don't have like $, parenthesis, quote, dot, add, just all this other stuff going on. It makes it a little bit easier to follow those pieces, but I want to show you sort of both steps to make that happen. Okay, and to be clear, to notice this, that again, this thing does select everything. So for example, if I select my paragraphs, I can add classes to all my paragraphs, add class. Let's make them, I don't know, here, let's make them text primary. We'll make them all blue, just for the moment. And again, this will apply to all paragraphs. All paragraphs become blue, right? So again, you just have to say, do something to whatever is, so this will do the change to whatever elements, whatever they are, might be, however many there are, that you happen to have selected. Okay, cool. Great. Save that. Refresh, you're good. Other things to note. Let's see. There's that one. I also do want to call out, because it's particularly useful, probably one of my favorite functions, is there is a toggle function that toggles the presence of a class. So if the class, so for example, toggling background dark says if that element already had the background dark class, remove it, right? Toggle, like basically like flip it off. If it wasn't already there, add it, flip it on. So it becomes like a light switch, right? So if it was off, it flips it to on. If it was on, it flips it to off. So that toggle lets you sort of switch it back and forth without having to do any other kind of logical work, which is probably why we're using Bootstrap or using jQuery, because it lets us do that kind of thing. Okay, it is possible to add specific CSS properties. So if you don't want to necessarily add a whole class, though I recommend that's really the best way of making any stylistic changes. But if you want to just like modify a single CSS property, it's possible to do that as well by using the .css function. And this works the same way. So similar to the .attribute function, where I'm going to say, great, first specify what property I want to modify, followed by a comma, followed by then what value I want to assign to that property. So for example, I could say, let's take my paragraphs, and I could say, let's apply them some CSS. Let's make their font size be, we'll make it huge. We'll make it 3 EMs so it becomes really, really big. All right. Boom, really, really big text. Yeah. In general, I don't recommend doing this. It's generally better practice and better style to add classes and have the classes apply those individual rules. However, the .css thing can be useful if you're trying to dynamically add in like background images, and you want to be able to have that background image coming off of something else. That can help you. It can help you do that kind of thing pretty well. And I want to just indicate that you can do some. Sometimes you don't have a class, you don't want to create a class, you want to just sort of add an individual piece. Cool. So that lets us start modifying the DOM. So again, what this is doing is basically letting us write down JavaScript code that says what changes should I apply to the existing HTML. Come on, there we go. My browser's being a little slow. Okay. The other thing we can do using jQuery, or using DOM manipulation in general, is we can add in new elements or add in additional content. So for example, I can add an additional paragraph by using what's called the append function. The append function will add in whatever element I've sort of specified in the argument, which again will be specified as a string, and it adds that to the end of the current content. So for example, let's see, look at my HTML. So my paragraphs are inside of this first section. Let's give this an ID so I can talk about it. This is going to be text, right? Section with the ID of text. So for example, I could talk about then the text section. Text section is going to then be the thing that has an ID of text in it. All right, because remember I gave it an ID, and that's why we gave it an ID. So then I can do things like, say, take my text section, and I could append a new element that's going to be a paragraph with some content. You know, this is going to be new content. New content, yay! Inside of there. There we go. Let's go ahead and refresh. Boom, new content, new paragraph, as it goes. This is different than the .html function, because the .html function will replace everything that's already there. This lets me add in new stuff. There's also other ways I can do this. I actually, like, there's, whatever. Like in jQuery, there's even if you just, like, say, append a paragraph without specifying what that paragraph is, it'll still go ahead and create that new empty paragraph, even if you don't put a close tag. So there's actually some shortcuts you can use in jQuery to get it working, which you shouldn't ever need to worry about, but, you know, sometimes it can be useful depending on what you're trying to do. All right, cool. New content, yay! Maybe that's why my guy is surprised, because there's new content. Okay. So that's some of the really common methods you might use for manipulating the DOM, right? So again, the structures here are you're going to use this $sign thing to get a label, get a reference, be able to talk about a particular element of your web page. You can then use functions like .atext, .html, .attribute, add class, toggle class, append, to be able to then manipulate or modify what the content of that HTML is, right? What its attributes are, what its classes are, CSS classes are, what its content is inside, which elements exist in it all. And that basically lets you then manipulate the DOM with jQuery. Not too terrible, I hope, right? Figuring out how to do complex things requires some thinking through, but in terms of just doing quick changes, lets you apply some fairly small changes easily. Particularly, I will note it if you lean on Bootstrap's CSS classes and a lot of its utility classes, you can get a lot of really good Google effects very quickly, and I'll sort of show you. We'll do some examples of that in exercises and in the demo if I have time for it. Okay. I do want to note that if you go to jQuery's website, and if you just Google jQuery, you'll get to its. So for here, Google jQuery. You go to jQuery's website. If you go to API documentations, where you'll find information about how it works, and that's a link from the slide as well, you can get a list of every single function that jQuery provides. And it's a really, oh my god, where's the end? Really long list. Along the sidebar here, if your browser is large enough, it will have them organized into categories, so you can sort of begin seeing how they work. So for example, if you're interested in manipulation, which is what we're doing, and you want to do things like, I want to insert some content inside another element, I could go to the insertion inside functions, and that will then give me a list of which insert functions I can use. There's append, there's HTML, there's text. If I want to do things like if I want to remove DOM elements, I can click on DOM removal, and I can see there's a couple of different removing functions, and they all work slightly differently. If you click on any of these, and I'll just show you, this may be a little bit too in-depth, but if you click on any of these, like DOM insert inside, if we go to our append function, it will then tell you how to call that function a little bit. The brackets here mean optional content. And like this is a little bit hard to read if you haven't done a lot of documentation work, but it does give you a ton of examples. Part of what I love about jQuery as a library is it gives you so many examples of what to do. So it says, for example, here's my initial HTML. If I run this jQuery code, right, again, selecting the .inner, class with .inner, appending this paragraph, then it tells you what you get after that, right? Doing this, starting with this, doing this, produces this. It'll show you exactly how this works. And it goes through sort of all the different examples about how these pieces come together with lots of examples that you can sort of see in action. So if you're trying to figure out how to use any of these things or how to do any of this work, look through these examples. They might require a lot of reading code and a lot of sort of processing to be like, oh my god, what the hell is going on with this JavaScript stuff? And that's okay. And sometimes, some of it might be harder to understand than others because we're just getting started. But they'll often give you a lot of good sample places to work from in order to see how something works. So you don't never need to just go in blind and guess. You very much can always be like, they did it like this. Can I do something similar to achieve the effect that I want? So there's lots of examples of that, and we'll sort of show off a couple more we'll do some other jQuery practice stuff in exercises and so forth. The other place I might want to talk about that's fun, under effects, you can get some things like hide and show, and toggle. We'll do some examples of these that lets you do things like lets you produce some animated kind of effects that can be really, really fun. Actually, here, you know what? We'll tell you how it works. I'm just gonna do it live. So, for example, if I go to my console, I can just type in stuff. We could say, let's select my header, and let's hide the header. Boom, goes away. Yay! And in fact, if I then try to hide it slowly, hold on, refresh page, hide it slowly, I can make stuff disappear. I can then show it slowly, hide it slowly. Ignore this other stuff that's being outputted here. That's just jQuery junk. But yeah, so again, we can do. So there's some really fun effects you can get with jQuery without a lot of effort. At least I don't think it's a lot of effort. Whew, okay. All right. Half an hour in, we've got basically that stuff working. Okay. So that's great. That lets us modify the DOM, right? That lets us write some JavaScript code that lets us change what my web page is going to look like. That said, so far, everything we've done in jQuery and with JavaScript, we might as well have just done in the HTML by just typing in different HTML content. So what we're trying to do then instead is we want to make do this kind of stuff, but we want to do this kind of stuff in response to the user input, right? In order to make it interactive, right? We want stuff to happen interactively, not just when the page loads. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is by using what is called event handling. So in sort of the world of computing, whenever you do something to your computer, whenever you click a button, whenever you move the mouse, whenever you type in the keyboard, this is an event from the computer's perspective. The computer thinks of this as, it's an event. Something amazing has just happened. The user clicked the mouse. Oh, like fireworks everywhere, right? It's this really, it's a significant kind of event that occurs. Now, in programming languages like JavaScript, we can do what's called listening for those events. We can basically try to keep an ear open for like, hey, when one of these events occurs, we can then do something. It's really similar to like following someone on Twitter or on Facebook or on social media, and effectively like subscribing to their feed, right? Then whenever they update, whenever they post something, whenever they like something, or whenever they do something, you'll then get a notification, right? You then get told that, and because you've then told, oh, this person posted they posted a new article, we can then respond to that event occurring. And so we're going to write code that's going to basically say, hey, when something happens, we're going to follow a button, right? And when that button gets clicked, we're going to then be able to respond to that button being clicked. Okay. So how's it going to work? What we're going to do is we're going to register a listener. We're basically going to follow an existing button to make it do something. So how that's going to work? Let's see. We'll leave that there for the minute. We'll leave it there for the moment. Okay, so first I'm gonna go ahead and get myself a reference to, I've got a button on my page, right? Remember my button? Click me button. I got a reference to it, I got that button, so I'm gonna go ahead and make a reference to it. So I'm going to select, the button. Great. Now that I have that button, I'm going to listen to it. I'm going to hit follow on it. I'm going to subscribe to that button so that anytime that button does something, I can respond to it. I can do some work. The way we're going to do that is by taking my button, and we're going to call a method on it the same way we call this .append method or this add class method. We're going to call a method on my button with a dot. And the method we're going to call is called on. Here's my example here. So we say button on some event, do something is kind of the language we're using. So it's like on this event, on the occurrence of this event, do some work. So the first argument here is going to be what kind of events we're listening to. Because again, just like with Twitter, somebody could post something, like something, follow something, retweet something. We may only want to follow certain ones of those. Same thing happens in JavaScript. We say, what kind of event do we want to listen to for? 90% of the time, these are click events, right? When somebody clicks on something, that's what I want to respond to. So I'm going to say on a click event, do some work. The second argument then is going to be the name of a function that I want to execute, that I want to call when somebody clicks on that button. So for example, I can make myself a function, remember functions, what to do when clicked, right? That's a function here. It's going to take in an event argument, and then I'm going to like log out, right? I got clicked. You clicked me, yay. Right, so there's a function that does some work, right? I could call this function myself, what to do when clicked, but I'm never going to. Instead, this is going to be sort of a recipe. It's basically, you can think of it almost like it's a subset of instructions, right? So these are going to be instructions to follow later. Right, I'm defining that function. Then in my button, I can say when my button gets clicked, then what I want to do is I want to follow some instructions, but I need to write down the name of which instructions to follow, right? What recipe should I follow when the button gets clicked? And the recipe I want to follow is the one that I called what to do when clicked. What to do when clicked. So then what will happen now? I go to my console, refresh my page. When I click on the button, it logs out, you clicked me, yay. So that when I click the button, it's going to then go ahead and execute this function, do this work, and log out what I wanted, right? You clicked me, yay. And again, this function could have lots of lines of code. Thanks. Right, so I click on the button, and it says, you clicked me, yay, thanks. If I click on the button again, it does it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and great, I've got a clicking thing. And that's how we make stuff interactive. That's the basic idea. So that whenever I say, okay, when a button gets clicked, specify what recipe to follow, and then up here, earlier I've said, here's what the recipe should do, and this recipe can then do things like start manipulating or modifying the DOM, right? So you can start doing any of this kinds of stuff later. So, for example, say you click me yay, let's go ahead and say that when this button gets clicked, let's go ahead and take my button, and we can change its text content to be I've been clicked. So again, I'm just using the same kind of thing that I did up here. I'm saying select the element and then manipulate it as the sort of the process that happens when I want to follow my sub-recipe. Then when somebody says on that clicking event happens, do that recipe, and that recipe says to log some stuff out and then change the button. So click me, and he now says, I've been clicked. Now we have this dynamic interactive button. Kind of fun, right? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Let me get rid of some other stuff here. Yeah, I'm gonna delete a bunch of the stuff. Well, you know what? Go down. I want to make sure that we can see everything. Cool. Now that's sort of the basic idea, right? On button click, do this sub recipe. That said, the most common way you'll see this written, if you look at JavaScript code and sort of the way that people tend to write this, is they actually don't specify a recipe up here and then say on click, do that recipe by name. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, on a button click, follow this recipe that I'm making up right now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm basically just going to take this function, right, this whole thing, I'm going to hit copy, and I'm going to go ahead and just replace the name with the whole function to begin with. I'm just going to paste it right in there. I'm then going to get rid of delete the name of the function, which I'm allowed to do in JavaScript, because now I don't need a name for it, because it's now defined as this function I want to run. So that right there, button on click, there's the thing I want to do when I get clicked, right? On click, do this recipe that does this kind of work. This does produce this really, and again, this is just a normal function that doesn't have a name. It does produce this really weird kind of thing at the end where I've now got my closing brace, which is closing up my function's body. But then after that is this parenthesis, which is ending my on thing, right? So you have to sort of see where your braces and parentheses end up matching out. So this tends to be a little bit more common way of writing things. That said, if this basic idea makes more sense to you, go for it and do that. That's totally okay. I got no qualms about that. But this is how you'll often see me. I'll often be writing code if you're looking at code that I'm writing. And if you're looking at code that anyone else has written, it'll often be structured in this kind of way. Cool. And that's how we add, I mean, that's how we make things, right? That's how you add, make it dynamic, right? Click me, now I've been clicked. And we can start making our page do more interesting things if we really wanted to. So for example, let's, I'm gonna comment out my Lego header stuff for the moment. All right, so we're gonna go back to, this guy. Yeah, comment it out. Nope, just comment it, right? Go back for my Lego to be smiling. We can do some more stuff. We can say, great, let me take my Lego header, image header, and we're gonna add an event handling, and we're gonna actually add in a mouse over event. Yep, mouse over is gonna be when my mouse goes over it, hovers over it, right? We're gonna basically respond to that event. If so, there's a function that happens then. And then when somebody the mouse hovers over it, actually here, we're gonna actually use mouse enter. Is the name of the function. So when the mouse enters it, goes over the function, then we can go ahead and make him surprised. Let's see if I can get that working. I think that's gonna do what I want. Surprised, right? You move the mouse over and he becomes surprised. And then because I'm feeling silly, I can also then say, take my mouse exit event, right? When the mouse leaves, so mouse has entered him, mouse has exited him. When we exit him, we can go back to just being happy. So now, mouse, you know what? I think it's mouse leaves. I think actually property. I think enter and leave. There we go. So he's happy. And now it looks like he's responding to the movement of my mouse. Because he is responding to the movement of my mouse. And again, how we've done that is we just use this, we use this basic thing we've already done, right? I said, great, give me a reference to my Lego image header. Did that up here. Be able to specify its attribute, changing what picture is being shown here. And then I simply added in to say, well, when this thing happens, the mouse moves in, change. When the mouse moves out, unchange. There's a little bit of sort of practice and refinement to know sort of what kinds of properties to do this with, but that should get us to being able to then, again, create interactive, content. And ta-da, there, great, look, we've got interactive content. And that's really it. That's how you use JavaScript to make web pages interactive. That's really sort of the basic version of things. Of course, more complex web pages will have more complex JavaScript interactivity. When we start adding in things like control structures, like being able to make decisions based on the current state of the page, you can start getting more and more work on, but that requires a little bit more JavaScript sort of expertise that I'm not requiring us to have, so I'm going to sort of skip it. We're going to sort of stay with the basic stuff, because this is, again, the taste that I want you to have of these kinds of things. Great, cool. And that's the basic idea of how to get JavaScript to do interactive stuff. Cool. That's it. Okay. So I got more time for this video. There is one other thing I want to then show. Right, so this is how we can then make basic interactive elements, and we've done this so far, right? We've now gone ahead and we've made an image interactive when we mouse over it, and I've made a button, that's interactive when I click on it or something happens. So the other thing I want to mention that you can do, though, with JavaScript type stuff is that it's also possible to get a lot of good and sort of like basic functionality and interactive pieces without necessarily writing a bunch of JavaScript code yourself, without writing a lot of it, but with instead just using Bootstrap. So the Bootstrap CSS framework actually provides a bunch of interactive, what are called widgets or components, that basically lets you have some kind of interactivity without actually having to write separate JavaScript code. Bootstrap instead provides its own JavaScript code that you can then use to do that work. So you can see a list of these under Bootstrap components. So like by default, it opens up the accordion, and you can again see an example of the accordion. Like this is where you can have things like collapse and expand out, right? Again, and Bootstrap will give you the ability to do this just by applying a particular set of HTML classes and attributes without having to write any JavaScript yourself. That said, though, you can use more JavaScript to then customize these in different ways. So I want to sort of show you how that works, just so you can get a sense for being able to do this. Because often, if you're trying to, for example, on projects or on sort of basic applications, if you're trying to produce some kinds of like basic effects like expandables, collapsibles, the carousels are like, slideshow type things. drop downs, modals, navbars. Like there's a bunch of these functional pieces that are sort of built into Bootstrap that you can get these kinds of effects really easily. Fun fact, Canvas implements a bunch of these things. So all the drop down stuff on the Canvas homepage is actually coming from Bootstrap accordion drop down stuff. That's actually what's driving a lot of this stuff together. Cool. All right. So let me give you an example about how this works. So in order to make this work, there's one thing we have to do. So we've got to include the Bootstrap CSS, which we've already done. And then I also have to include the Bootstrap JavaScript library. So the same way that I included the jQuery JavaScript library to let me say use jQuery like interactivity stuff, jQuery JavaScript code, I have to do the same thing with Bootstrap to include some Bootstrap JavaScript code. So I'm copying this off of the slide. If you go to Bootstrap's homepage, it's listed under the JavaScript bundle, right? The JavaScript thing. There's the script tag. That's when you would include. And again, it's really important that we include the Bootstrap JavaScript before our own script, so that way our own script can work with the Bootstrap stuff if we need to. It's generally best practice to include jQuery first before Bootstrap, and that way Bootstrap can actually use jQuery and integrate with jQuery in effective ways if it needs to. Though we won't actually, I don't think we'll actually do any of that. Great, so I've gone ahead and I've now included Bootstrap, so that now Bootstrap's there. It doesn't change anything to begin with. All right, cool. So let's do an example. I'm going to do an example using collapsibles, because this is like the most basic example, and I think one of the funner ones to do. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to make it so that when we click on a button, we're going to be able to hide or show, right, toggle what we see of a particular element. So the way that we're going to do that, I'm actually going to, this is the example, well, let's see. Let's do that. Let's make it so when I click me, let's go ahead and make it so that it's actually going to then hide or show this section of content. All right, cool. Okay, so in order to do that, in order to make something collapsible, what we're going to need to do is we're first going to need to give that element a collapse class. We're going to need to say, what is the thing that can collapse, that can be hidden and go away? So I can go to my paragraph section, and I'm going to add in the collapse class. I'm adding that in. I'm keeping the my2 as in that's a margin on the y-axis, so that's going to be top and bottom margin. So I'm keeping those margins in just for spacing here. So we're going to give this the collapse class. What that does, you'll notice that hides it. It collapses it. It's gone. It's not shown to begin with. If we go to our collapse documentation, we can also then see, for example, we can use the .collapse.show in order to actually show that content. So, for example, we want to have it start out there. We could use collapse.show as our class. And then it starts out being there. Okay, then we need to have our button do some stuff. So we've got our button. In order to make our button modify this collapsingness thing, we're going to add a special Bootstrap attribute to our button. And that attribute we're going to add is called data-bs for Bootstrap, not for something else, Bootstrap, -toggle, because this is going to be this is basically saying that this button is going to toggle, add or remove, right, flip it on and off like a light switch, the collapsing property of something. The attribute starts with data because all HTML attributes that are not built into the HTML language, that are like special bootstrappy things or special whatever things, always have to start with data. They're called data attributes. So we're going to use data-bs-toggle collapse to indicate that I want this button to modify the collapsingness of something. So again, I can go to my button. Where'd my button go? There's my button. So here's my button. And I'm going to go ahead and add in my data-bs collapse thing. You can put all of these on one line. That's like totally okay. You know, like this is how you would write it. I'm putting the attributes onto their own lines just to make it a little bit easier to read for me, right? Just so that I don't have to scroll across the page as much. So for example, I'm here, leave my IDs here, my class is there, but I'm going to add in my BS toggle down there. Cool. So by default, that doesn't do anything, right? Still just says I've been clicked, right? That's all that's happening. But so what we're going to need to do is we're going to indicate then, add another attribute that says what element do we want to collapse, or what element are we flipping up and down, right? What switch are we switching? So to do that, we're going to add in a another attribute called data-bs-target, whose value is going to be an ID selector for the element that we want to modify, right? So it's going to be pound ID of element. And in this case, I'm going to give the thing I collapsed, like in this example, it's collapse example. In my other thing, right, the thing I want to do is I want to collapse my text, ID of text. So I can make it so my button is going to have the data BS target, right? This is the thing that I want my toggling to apply to, is going to be the ID text element. And that's where we need to go. So then I refresh this. So now I can click it, and it hides it, shows it, hides it, shows it, hides it. You'll notice the first time around when I clicked it, it like expanded out. That's because originally it thought that it was like the first time I clicked it, it was like, oh, I'm trying to unhide it. It tried basically hide it and unhide it. Like something gets a little bit weird there. We could probably double check about how to make it so that it starts out expanded and doesn't start out collapsed. But we'd have to tweak it a little bit. You know, we'll let someone else figure it out, or I'll figure it out later. Or generally, if you're using collapse thing, you don't do it that way. Cool. So that's an example of how we can then use data attributes to basically add in, you know, interactive effects. It's pretty easy without having to actually write any JavaScript. There is JavaScript we can do to do this work, right? There's an example when you hit via JavaScript, it actually has an example of like how you'd write the code. It's a little bit messy. I would not actually use this kind of code to make that work, but here's a way that you can, you know, but there is some details about how to use JavaScript to make it do the thing you want to do. This one's a little easier example about how to make that happen. Okay, awesome. So the other thing I want to note here, right? So this example has been taken from the Bootstrap documentation. You'll notice there's some other argument attributes here as well. These are just ARIA attributes, right? We learned about these a couple, you know, back in like the 3rd or 4th week of class. These are for screen readers, right? This is basically saying that, hey, this is telling us that whether it's false expanded or not, like we're just keeping a value there to sort of track whether or not that's happening, so that screen readers know whether this thing exists, is visible or not visible, right? Keeping that information together. And we're then indicating where you can find the controls for that expandedness property. So when you're looking at these examples in the collapse documentation, so for example, this is literally, I tweaked some pieces from this example code here, right? Here's my example of it working. But when you're looking at these examples, you might see a whole bunch of like random attributes, right? You're like, okay, great, I've got this button, but this button's got all these things associated with it. You really just need to take some time to read and look at these attributes fairly carefully to try to figure out then what is each one doing. And if you read the text will tell you how they works, sort of, usually. Right? So it's not that all of these attributes or all of these elements are required to make something work whenever they're using them in a demo. These demos are often just trying to show a bunch of different things, and so they've got some styling, some other structure stuff there as well. Like, the fact that this has class button primary is not important, right? The fact that it's got type button isn't necessary because the type value isn't necessary, right? The fact that this is a card inside of here isn't required. That's not necessary for making it do its job. That's really just there to, like, make the demo look better. So you want to be able to read these examples carefully and really try to get a sense for what is each attribute doing rather than just copying and pasting a chunk of code and hoping that it works, because that way you'll be able to sort of try to actually understand what's going on, and that way you only get the parts of the code that are actually relevant for you getting the effect that you want. All right, cool. Okay, I want to do one more example, which is the nav bar, because a lot of people have been asking about how do I do the nav bar and the hamburger menu and the collapsible thing, and how do I make that all work? And how we can do it, there's two answers, right? One, you can do it really easily with this kind of thing, right? For example, I can do something like, you could imagine, I might have like my hamburger icon, and I can then say on a click event of that, run some function, let me scroll down, right? Run some function, and then on that function, I might take my then, right, I might then say, let's select my drop-down navigation thing, right? Go grab whatever my drop-down navigation thing is, down nav, and I can, for example, call the toggle function on it, and that will then make it appear or hide when we click on the hamburger icon, right? So that way, we can basically, as long as I've initially hidden this drop-down nav, when they click on the hamburger icon, we can toggle whether or not it's viewable. So even without Bootstrap, if you've like sort of built in your own hamburger icon or your own drop-down thing, you can produce that kind of effect with I'm sorry, with 2 lines of code. With, you know, I mean, it always looks like this, but that can get you the kind of effect you're interested in. Okay, but I do want to give an example of how Bootstrap makes stuff work. There's also this example of how we can integrate with Bootstrap and sort of learn how these things come together. Okay, so here's the nav bar. Right, so this is the nav bar. It's, again, one of these components under nav bar. However, to find the hamburger menu, you got to scroll down to the very bottom, looking for responsive behaviors, right? That's when things get smaller. And you can then find the toggler. And then there's a bunch of different examples. So here's a toggler that has no navbar brand shown at the smallest breakpoint, right? So when things get small, but the brand goes away. All right, fine, whatever. Let's give this a shot. So I'm gonna just go ahead and take this large block of code, copy it, and I'm gonna paste it into my HTML. Let's go ahead and let's add a navbar. We're gonna add it above the header. Boom! Big old block of code pasted in there. So, bunch of stuff happening here, right? Like, okay, navbar expand large, navbar light, background light. So a bunch of styling happening here. Container fluid, that's some styling. Button, navbar toggler, that seems okay. Ah, look, data BS toggle collapse. There's that same thing going on again, right? There's the target is the navbar toggler demo 01. Okay, so we're looking for an element that has ID navbar toggler demo 01. Ah, there's my navbar target demo 01 on my navbar collapse, right? So here's where my collapsing thing can kind of happen. Right, and that's where we're starting to see that interaction, right? So that's, again, how we can read this code to figure out what it's actually doing. But so when we paste in that example, there we go. Let's make my page a little bit bigger. There we go. So here's my whole navbar brand, right? Hidden brand, right, whatever. Here's all my links. When I then shrink it down, when it decides it's not big enough, it turns it into a hamburger menu, and when I click on the hamburger menu, it expands out, and there's my form. Notice the I've been clicked thing is because my JavaScript is applying to all buttons, right? Because I select every button, because there used to only be one button on the page, but now this hamburger thing is a second button, so that doesn't work anymore. So I can now make sure, for example, this button only applies to the demo button. So let's go ahead and make it so this becomes the demo button, and then I want the demo button to change to I've been clicked. There we go. Hamburger. Cool. So that's the easy way of getting like a hamburger menu into Bootstrap. And then you can try to figure like, okay, I don't want all this stuff, right? You're like, okay, I'm looking here, I don't want a search form. So I've got my collapsible thing. So here's everything that's showing up inside the collapsible div, right? I don't want a search form, so let's get rid of the form element. We can make that go away. Okay, that goes away. Here's an example of a disabled link. All right, I don't need that disabled link. Get rid of that guy. There we go. Now I've got my brand and my 2 links, and I can shrink them down to a hamburger, brand, and 2 links. Cool. And how do I know they're links? Look, they're just LI elements, and they've got this nav link class to make them work. Totally honest, I'm not sure which of these navbar link classes are necessary to. I don't think any of them are. None of them are necessary for the hamburger thing, right? The hamburger thing is simply a toggle button, right? That's all it is, and it's going to have it just has this navbar toggler icon. That's all it is. It's making it turn into a hamburger. That's it, right? There's a span toggler thing. Everything else is just styling to make it look like a nice navbar, which you can of course then replace and structure that with your own styling work. So, 2 approaches if you want to get the hamburger thing working, right? Copy and paste in a chunk of Bootstrap and tweak it and start modifying and deleting things and making it, styling it the way you want. Gets you the effect you're interested in. And again, there are variations here in the documentation for if you want to have the toggler on the right side, they have an example of how that would work. If you want the toggler on the left, but the brand name on the right, you can see how that works. And we can shrink this page. Shrink this page. Where's my toggler? Toggler. Right. To oh my god. Maybe we can't shrink the page. All right, takes a little bit to make this work. There we go. Right. So you can basically say great, here it is, toggled, right? Toggler on the left, brand name on the right, right? When we get to small pages, right, left, no brand name. So you can sort of, again, see the examples of how to do different pieces depending on what kind of thing you're trying to do. Cool. Right. That's kind of what's fun about Bootstrap is they have working examples. You can experiment them. You just have to get the page resizing thing to work correctly. Okay, but yeah, so that's one way of getting Bootstrap, getting the hamburger menu done. But the other, as I also said, we can also then go ahead and just, you know, write my do it myself, right? Where I can basically say grab my, I guess I deleted that stuff. This guy, right? Say select your hamburger icon, specify when you click on it, then you know toggle hide or show your drop down menu just using jQuery. So we can get the same kind of effect even writing pure JavaScript code if you don't want to try to get, if you don't want to have to try to fight through the whole bootstrappy thing to make that all work. You can get the same thing in JavaScript code. Okay, and that's the basic idea. So again, there's just like, I know it's a lot of pieces because it's a lot of syntax steps, but what you really need to just remember is the $sign using to get a label to refer to an element, the functions that we call like add class dot attribute dot HTML or text to be able to then modify that DOM element, those HTML elements. This idea of using this dot on thing, dot on click comma function stuff, right? Using this particular weird line, you know, code syntax to indicate what I want to do something in response to an event. And that's it. That's interactive JavaScript. Everything else is really, I mean, is details. Everything else to do more complex work is just coming up with more complex, like algorithmic stuff about figuring out when I want to click things and what I want to have happen when I click those, which is not required for this class, but we can totally get into that. If you have any questions about that, let me know, and I'm happy to go into that in more detail. Great. Otherwise, good luck. And if there's any questions or anything, please let me know.